Good afternoon and welcome back. Sean here, Mountains Garage, on a beautiful Saturday afternoon. I believe it's January 21st. I do know it's Saturday. Mid-afternoon on just a normal day. Today, I came out after lunch. After I made lunch, I had steak and rice. It was pretty good. After machining up the pivot for the brake pedal for the Race 55 yesterday and the day before, my 1967 Logan lathe model 1825 was absolutely filthy. Over time, small pieces of Scotch-Brite and sandpaper and files and chips and oil from lubricating the ways and the mechanisms, and the chip tray, it was just disgusting. It'd been a while since I'd given it any love. So that was the first order. I actually started, you can't see it, but I swept up all around my grinders and ended up cleaning the lathe some. Interesting discovery. I reached my oil can the other day and it was empty. I typically use this yellow Chinese one that I picked up somewhere along the way, because I do like the pump action. I never reached for the other two because they were mung colored, they were brown. Again, the Logan lathe, 1967. I bought it from the original owner's family. Those oil cans came with it. In just for kicks, I wiped it with a rag and I could see it had color, and then you can see the result. And now they're all full, ready to go, of my Mobile Vactra #2 oil, whey oil. But underneath, the silver one, hand marked, I'd flip it over, but I'd leak all over myself now, is marked 95 cents. The gold one has a little sticker, old school, says true value, 98 cents. So you gotta figure the old guy, well, he probably wasn't old at the time, when he proudly bought his lathe just a few towns over, brought it home and was setting it up much like I've done with every piece of equipment here. He ran down to the hardware store, got himself a couple of oil cans, and now, today, they look like new again. But the subject of today's video comes up, or is presented to me at least once a week, if not more. Powerglide or Turbo 400? Often the person asking the question has a chance to buy one or the other, and they're not sure what they want. It's a common misconception that the Powerglide is cheaper. It's not. So right off the bat, let's get that out in the open, and here's why. To successfully build a semi-strong Powerglide that you can put behind a performance engine, you're going to spend more than a Turbo 400 because you need, at minimum, an input shaft. The stock Powerglide input shaft is weak, and it's also a different spline. If you change just the input shaft, you can put a turbo spline converter because the stator tube has the same spline, and your choices of torque converters are much more plentiful. Side note, you have to have a Bush turbine in your converter because the Powerglide does not have a front stator bushing. So we've covered that before, but you can't just put any turbo spline converter in your Powerglide because catastrophic results will happen, and I see that often as well. So you need an input shaft, and you need a clutch hub. The clutch hub in a Powerglide is made of paper almost. It's not going to take any amount of power before it breaks. So now you've bought an input shaft and a clutch hub. No big deal, right? Well, your lower gear set, they only came in two varieties. 1.76 was your V8 gear ratio, and 1.82, 182 was for 6-cylinder cars. The 182 gear set is weak. It will not take any amount of power, traction, and weight, the magic combination that breaks things. And the 176 is okay if you have a mildly warmed over. You can probably run high 9, quarter mile with something like that in a Camaro or something for a while. But at any given point, that's going to fail too. So if you buy a core transmission and if you're unsure of the ratio, go back and watch my Powerglide videos. I have a few. I made a tool, and you can buy a tool as well if you're Powerglide hunting. It's just a little aluminum go, no-go gauge, because despite the fact that Powerglide takes the same yoke as a Turbo 350 and your small output shaft Muncies, Saginaw 4-speeds, etc., they all share the same yoke. Turbo 400 is the oddball, and the big spline Muncies and the Super T10s. So you only had pretty much 2 choices in a slip yoke. But despite the fact the Powerglide 176 and 182 gear set takes the same yoke, the 176 is physically bigger. So I have a go, no-go gauge, and if it won't fit on the shaft, I know it's a 176. If it goes right on, it's a 182. So you can buy that tool. Wicked handy. This is a tool that I made. Pretty simple. Another way to tell, the input shafts are different lengths for the 182 versus the 176. And you can wiggle the input shaft out of a Powerglide, but there's no guarantee you're going to get it back in. I get that question a lot too. Can I just change the input shaft and bolt it in? Well, no. Jumping ahead, but a stock Powerglide has linkage that goes all the way to the throttle linkage on the carburetor. And that's not kick down. That is like a modern day cable drive 700R4, for instance. That sets your pressures and shift points. You need that linkage hooked up if you're going to attempt to run the stock valve body. But I'm not going to build you one with a stock valve body. We're going to buy a trans brake valve body. So now we just spent another $500 or $600 for a valve body. For the same reasons, when we compare this to the Turbo 400, you need increased pressure, you need more clamping ability. You have to turn the pressures up somehow, and that's a great way to do it. In a Powerglide especially, with a nice, well-designed valve body. So now, going back to the gear ratios, if you want to upgrade that, let's just do a little math here. People love math. A gear set for Powerglide, call it $1,000. The input shaft and clutch hub, that's going to run you probably $300. A good valve body, $500 or $600. We still need to rebuild this Powerglide. Chances are you're going to need a decent band. Their bands aren't quite as hardy as the Turbo 400 bands that you can reuse most of the time. And I have a few select OEM Powerglide bands that I keep, and I have no problem using them if they're in good shape, but more often than not, it's 50-50 whether they're worth using or not. I like to press out the stator tube on a Powerglide pump, front pump, and buy a hardened one and pin it into the pump. So now you've bought a stator tube. These are all things you don't need to do to a Turbo 400. The amount of clutches in a Powerglide needs to be increased. A lot of times there's very few, so you put more in the reverse clutches and definitely in the high clutch drum. So you're going to need a lathe to cut the piston down in both cases, and you're going to need extra clutches that aren't going to come in a stock rebuild kit. They don't come with enough to improve, kind of like a Turbo 400. But with a Turbo 400, you can run the stock amount of clutches to a high level of power. Well beyond 1,000 is pretty much the accepted norm. And to wrap it out without picking on the old Powerglide any further, is the case of the Powerglide is inherently weak and prone to cracking. when you turn the pressure up and apply stress. Therefore, an aftermarket case is an excellent idea, which adds at least another $1,000. So we've spent easily $3,000 to build the equivalent of a Turbo 400 that only requires a few parts for it to, let's just say we're shooting for that magic 800 to 1,000 horsepower recipe. I have a Turbo 400 video that's labeled just that. You can go back and watch it. It's in the playlist, but basically you build yourself a normal, relatively stock Turbo 400 with a few modifications and a decent valve body. You might as well buy a trans-brake valve body because you need a manual valve body anyway with a Turbo 400, so you can start your burnout in second and go to high, among other reasons. And you need the increased pressures that will probably overwhelm an automatic shifting Turbo 400. So that's why you go to manual valve bodies. Increased pressure and the ability to start in second gear in your burnout. So, but that you buy any Turbo 400 core pretty much if it matches the output shaft you're looking for, and I always go for the short one. Given the choice, unless you need a longer shaft, go with the short one because that's the majority of the Turbo 400s you're going to find. Again, you do all the normal stuff we do every time that don't require any great cost. And your big expense is going to be, a decent rebuild kit or parts to assemble a rebuild kit and a nice valve body. So, a whole lot cheaper than a Powerglide. Now, actual function. There's I won't call it an old wives' tale, but around 3,000 pounds or lighter. All things considered. Sometimes the Powerglide is faster, but that's kind of a blanket statement because there's a whole lot of other factors. Your first gear ratio in a Powerglide is in the 1.80 range, where the Turbo 400 is a 248. So the Turbo 400 is going to accelerate faster as long as it has traction, whereas the Powerglide is going to lean on the converter more. They prove out that they're both pretty quick and very comparable, but at a certain point, and it's proven by the fact that look at what every fast car in the country is running. They're running pretty much a Turbo 400 or a variant thereof. It's based still on the stock Turbo 400, even though there's not a whole lot of stock pieces left in it to handle thousands of horsepower, but the limit of the basic Turbo 400 has not been reached. The Powerglide at a certain level is going to be broken all the time. There's just no way around it. So, yeah, and that's, we're talking thousands of horsepower, but at some point in weight and traction, again, the magic trio that breaks things, at some point, if you're going to go really fast, you're going to need a Turbo 400. So when people come to me, it's usually a money thing. All spending stops at the back of the engine. From there back, nobody wants to spend any money. And, excuse me, I got to have this conversation often. I said, I will build you a Powerglide, but it's going to be much more expensive. So, now throughout this video, I've sounded pretty negative about the old Powerglide. And now the truth, I actually like them for a few reasons. One, they're lightweight. You can carry the thing around. You can almost put it in the car without a jack. There is another, misnomer, if you will. I mean, the Turbo 400 has more rotating mass stock, but you throw away a lot of parts in a Turbo 400, and then once you start going to aluminum drums, etc., that is pretty much, somebody's going to comment on my video, which is great. I love comments for lots of reasons. And, it is true that in theory, this takes more horsepower to run it, but you also have a lower first gear ratio. So, but anyway, back to liking the Powerglide. I like their compact size. They are easy to work on. You can whip that thing apart pretty fast. I can get these apart, relatively fast. They're more complicated to work on than a Powerglide. Powerglide is just about the simplest automatic transmission ever made when it comes to working on it. So there's very few parts in there, which is kind of a good thing. So I like that fact. They do fit in the exact spot as a TH350 or all your 4-speeds. Whereas the 400 is 1 inch longer, so it's always been the oddball. So if you're just doing some simple swapping, you don't have to move your cross member, and you can probably reuse your drive shaft and all that stuff. If you're talking a street vehicle, if you're building a race vehicle, you're probably going to build some really good stuff from the driveline perspective. At least I hope you are. So I guess we'll stop here. Now, I've also been asked to compare like the 400 to the 480E. That sounds like fun as well. So in a future video, we'll do just that. So enjoy the rest of your Saturday. Take this video for what it is, because you're crazy if you listen to me about anything. I'm just kidding. Thanks for watching, and I appreciate every one of you.